Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan Jeyarajah and Bobak Hayeri.
Bienvenidos. It's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan Jeyarajah, national college football writer for CBSSports.com. We're glad to have you with us, and we're once again partly international as I sit here in lovely Buenos Aires. The season is kicking off soon, and we are going to set our stage with teams that we think are going to be part of that initial focus here on the College Football Survivor Show. In our last episode, we built a broader list of candidates for initial placement on the island of college football playoff hopefuls. Today, we're going to look at the 12 teams we think would make it into the playoff if they were selected right now in the preseason. 11 teams from the P4, most likely. The 4 conference champions, plus 7 at large, plus our 3 G5 contenders for that automatic bid for the highest ranked G5 champion. Before we dive in, let me remind you that you can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Please take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Well, Shehan, guide our listeners through our process here on the College Football Survivor Show. For those joining us, especially as we launch into this season, how do we go about this?
Yeah, well, this is kind of the start of how our show gets its name, right? It's the Survivor Show. We're voting teams onto the island, and we're going to eventually vote teams off the island as well. And the way that we've done it in the past is obviously based on a 4-team college football playoff. We have a list of 12 teams, 12 contenders. Those are the only contenders and the only teams, essentially, that we talk about during college football season. With the 12-team playoff, we're kind of going to change up what that means. We're probably going to be a little more lax when it comes to, hey, if there's a team that's right on the edge of contending, we'll probably refer to them a little bit more. But for all intents and purposes, this is our group. The other thing we're going to change, because this is going to be realistic to the actual college football playoff, is we're going to have a list of 11 teams from the power conferences that we vote on to the island, and then have a separate list of 3 that will be the 3 top contenders from the group of 5, who will also continue to talk about for that reason. And so this is our first look at it, our first glance. We've talked about it over the past couple weeks. Being on this list is not the same as being in the preseason top 10. This is not a preseason list. This is our first look at trying to project what will the final top 11 to 12 look like. And that means we have to take into consideration some of who do we think is going to suffer against a tough schedule. We have to take under consideration which teams are very dependent on an injury-prone player, for example, right? All of this has to be taken into account. I know that we got some, actually, I don't know if you saw, we got some hate mail from Belarus last week, which I appreciated, for somebody saying, how could you include some of the teams that we included from the ACC, notably Miami, NC State, and Louisville, and not off the top include Florida State and Clemson, which were the 2 top teams ranked in the preseason AP poll? Well, I think it's a great time to get into it. You know, we felt like Florida State as a college football playoff contender and Clemson as a college football playoff contender did not have as direct a path as those other 3 teams. Doesn't mean that they won't be good. Frankly, I mean, I've talked about this at length with the Big 12, which is my conference of background. I think that there could be 6 teams from the Big 12 that end up in the top 22, and 5 of them might not be in the top 12. And ultimately, that's what we're actually trying to decide right now. So this first iteration, we're not going to actually rank the teams as yet. We'll get into that a little more next week as we head into the season. Technically, by the way, this is our first game week of the season because we do have a week 0 game, ironically, including those Florida State Seminoles. We're not going to vote teams off the island based off of a week 0 game in Ireland, just Ireland, just to be clear, unless Florida State does the funniest thing ever. But I think that this is a good opportunity to say this is our group of 11 plus 3 heading forward. We're going to call it a top 12. Just know that what we're talking about is the 11 plus 1 as well.
Yeah, I think you make a great point there, because as you look through the top 25 and then you look at their schedules, you know that inevitably, well, some of these teams are going to win and play each other. They're going to win and lose, not as frequently as they did in the past, because the conference bloat has made it so that a lot of teams miss other teams. And when I was putting together my list, I was looking at some of these schedules and thought, I'm not sure. Especially, for example, I know I did this quite a bit in the ACC. I was looking at schedules and like, who's likely to survive this? Or putting together at-large teams. I'm like, well, who is more likely than not necessarily going to win the biggest game on their regular schedule, but if you're the third place team in the SEC, by nature of not playing the toughest teams as frequently and missing the SEC title game, you're almost certainly going to be in that playoff, which I know for me, I was surprised which team I thought was going to be one of the initial at-larges from the SEC. But I think this is a good time to maybe get into it. I know we were talking about maybe looking at this at tiers, because we should probably start by just saying the teams, that are obvious picks. Like, for example, Georgia. I don't think anyone would be shocked if Georgia makes a playoff this season. If they don't, it'll probably be the story of the season, because the season will be going absolutely bonkers in Athens at that moment. But a team like the Georgia Bulldogs, we know what they've got. We know who they have on there. They return so much. The coaching smarts, so to speak, of Kirby and company. By all accounts, they should make it. I mean, in addition to Georgia, what other teams would you consider in that tier?
I had 3 teams that I considered in my number 1 tier, which would be, I would describe as, they are so expected to make the playoff in my mind that if they didn't, it would be a total unmitigated disaster. And that's Georgia, that's Ohio State. Those are my top 2 teams. I don't think it's a secret to anybody. And I also put Oregon in that group. The amount that those 3 teams have invested into this particular season is off the charts. Ohio State's athletic director, Ross Bjork, was the only one to actually say that we've invested $20 million in NIL into this season. But without question, Oregon and Georgia are also high on that list. Oregon especially, right, with some of the transfers that they brought in, Evan Stewart, Dylan Gabriel, along with the roster they were able to retain. Georgia, look, people used to say this about Alabama. They get a discount because you get to play for Nick Saban, and so they don't have to pay the same premiums as some other programs do. So I don't think that Georgia necessarily had to pay out $20 million to make this roster and season happen, but clearly they've invested in a big way. They've retained in a big way. This is a big season for this program. They have who I would consider to be the number 1 quarterback in college football in Carson Beck, which, this is a defensive program historically, and they've got the number 1 quarterback in college football in 2024. That's unbelievable. There are other teams that I think are close to this group, but these are the 3. I think that these are the 3 where they are, to me, essentially stone cold locks to make the college football playoff. There's a 4th team that probably up until a month ago I might have had on this list that we'll get to in a second.
I suspect I know which one.
Yeah, but I'm a little concerned.
Before we do, I just have to say I was thinking about these 3 teams, because those would have been the 3 I would have selected as well. I'm going to say Oregon is probably is an interesting one in this, only because that coaching staff is still fairly new overall. Yeah, but with the other 2, I was thinking to myself, if they don't make it, I mean, jokes aside, heads are going to roll. With the Georgia, I would say a coordinator will fall on their sword. But if it's Ohio State, Ryan Day, ooh, everyone will remember the conversation before, basically right up until the bowl season. And that will just continue on fire. I think that job would be in jeopardy. If it were Georgia, some heads might roll, maybe Mike Bobo, I'm not sure. Just because I'm trying to think who would be the easiest scapegoat. With Oregon,
he's always the easiest scapegoats.
Yeah, with Oregon, I'm not sure how that would go, but again, those are such unlikely scenarios that that's more of a humor kind of just a what if take, nothing realistic in that situation. But kind of going in your next tier, I'm curious, is the team you're talking about Texas?
It's the University of Texas. And one thing happened that makes me a little concerned, which is they had 2 major running back injuries. Christian Clark is their 4th-string running back. Not necessarily a huge loss in a vacuum, but made much worse by the fact they also lost CJ Baxter, their projected starting running back, who actually people might remember won the starting running back job a year ago at Texas over Jonathan Brooks because of how impressive he was as a true freshman. He was set to take a big role. And, some people have said, well, they lost Bijan Robinson and Roshan Johnson and replaced them with Jonathan Brooks, who was also the number one running back off the board. To that, I'd say, one, Jonathan Brooks was really, really good for sure. They missed Bijan Robinson a lot last year, I would argue. When you look at their red zone offense and some of the issues that they had there, I don't think that this was a team that ran the ball as effectively. And then when Jonathan Brooks went out, they took another step back. And I think they really struggled late in the year to convert in the red zone. I think you even look at some of their struggles against Washington in the college football playoff. Some of it was the fact that they became so pass dependent. And when I look at this Texas offense, I think that there are reasons to believe that down to down they might be a little bit better, but I don't think that they have the get out of jail free cards on offense and frankly on defense against the run the way that they did last year. Last year, I know that through 6 or 7 games, it was like something like 75% of their touchdowns were 25 or more yards, right? They were so dependent on big plays, and they had Xavier Worthy, A.D. Mitchell, and Jonathan Brooks who were able to convert them, not to mention Jatavian Sanders at tight end. Well, all 4 of those guys are now gone, and they brought in some really good transfers at receiver, certainly. I'm not going to pretend like they're going to be bad at receiver, but do they have those breakaway players? Do they have the guys who can turn a game on its head in 1 second? Especially with CJ Baxter out for the season, I don't feel quite as confident as I did. Now, I'll say, Texas is still my preseason number 4. Texas is still my number 2 in the SEC. I expect them to play against Georgia in a rematch, by the way, in the SEC championship game. But I don't think that after the loss of the 2 running backs, they're down to 3 scholarship running backs. They're going to have to move some guys over from other positions to try to fill that gap at running back. I just don't know that when I look at what Texas did well in 2023, that it's absolute turnkey in 2024. So they're absolutely right now my 4th team in the list of contenders. So to me, they're in the field. I'm voting them in, but they're not in that top group anymore.
Yeah, I agree about those injuries, and that was concerning to me because there was also another factor when I was looking at Texas. And it's interesting because, and I think it's because it's Texas. This is kind of a weird way to phrase it, but it's because it's Texas. It's because their first season in the SEC. I expect several teams who wouldn't necessarily make my cut for the island to give them absolute conniption fits. To a lesser extent, they have the non-conference game at Michigan. But then the Red River rivalry, I'm not sure Oklahoma is going to necessarily be a contender for the final playoff spot in a very crowded SEC this season. But they're going to, that's the Red River rivalry. We know how that game goes and how it goes every year. It's hard to predict. They have Georgia. Arkansas is a rivalry, and especially finale at Texas A&M. Again, excited about Mike Elko. I'm not necessarily ready to put him on the island just yet, but that's a game where, oh gosh, the Aggies are going to be ready for it, and it being at A&M, it's hard for me to place them in that tier. In fact, when I was revising my list, I actually moved them down to my personal list to number 5 because I was trying to look for the safest bets. And in that sense,
Sure.
And again, these aren't seeds because obviously we
Yes.
have to include the Big 12 and ACC by now. But I actually decided to move Notre Dame ahead of them. Not because
Sure.
I think head-to-head I would necessarily go with that, but I think the likelihood and the schedule for Notre Dame, as we've talked about, is more favorable. And ironically, they bookend the Texas A&M season with Texas, as we've talked about. But they enter the season with such great expectations from Marcus Freeman. As we've talked about, that year 3, the auspicious year in Notre Dame head coaching history. But I think with who he has at this particular season, I mean, we've talked about it, Riley Leonard. We've got Mike Denbrock out there who coached Jalen Daniels, obviously, the Heisman last year at LSU. I think if I'm, again, not that those first 3 teams, I'm not even beginning to claim that I see them as much of a lock as Ohio State, Georgia, or Oregon. But I think at this point, just with the injuries and with the fact that, oddly enough, Notre Dame does not have as many of the teams. I mean, they're going to have, obviously, every team that plays Notre Dame, they take glee if you could beat Notre Dame. They're one of those teams. We know that. But I just think Texas is going to have a slightly harder. And at this point, Yeah, we're talking teams 4 and 5. It maybe is just nitpicking, but I decided to move Texas a little ahead of Notre Dame a little ahead of Texas in this particular thing. But I consider them very much in the same situation if I were to kind of rank my preseason likelihood of reaching the college football playoff.
Yeah, I think that Notre Dame is also a pretty easy addition. I also had them on my list. I will say I'm fascinated to see what the actual team quality of Notre Dame is, because like you said, the pathway they go on the road to play Texas A&M. It's going to be a pretty tough game. We're going to talk about Florida State in a second. I'm a little lower on them than most, I'd say. And Notre Dame gets that game at home. Louisville, also, I think a tough game, but they get it at home. At USC, that's going to be an interesting one. But, again, a team that is a borderline top 25 team. So like the pathway to let's say 11-1 feels pretty easy to be honest. 11-1, 10-2. I think that maybe the more interesting question is if they're 10-2 but their losses are to Florida State and Texas A&M, do they still get in the field at that point? Like I think that that's a legitimate conversation. I think that overall I would still imagine that they do just because they're Notre Dame, and I think that they're going to earn some credibility that way. But I do think that they're a pretty safe bet. And again, once you start getting to this level, like the top three, those are locks. Everyone else, I think you can poke a little bit of a hole in their candidacy. For Notre Dame, it's going to be how do they deal with the loss of Charles Jagusa, the star left tackle who was projected to move into a starting role for them, and really just some of overall the offensive line production that they're going to have to replace. But they have a quarterback in Riley Leonard who's used to dealing with some of these issues during his time at Duke as well. So I think overall this is still a very safe bet. Um, so there's two other directions with teams that I'm going to go with this, and actually one of the directions is only one team. I think to me that Utah is a tier 2 team, and the reason that I say that is that one, I think they have a very good chance to win the Big 12. But even if they don't, I think that Utah is out of really, I might argue, the Big 12 and the ACC, the team that's best positioned if they don't win the conference to still make the college football playoff. And the reason that I say that, one, the schedule isn't too bad. I think that they're going to be able to get through it with 10 or 11 wins, most likely. Now, again, if they get a third loss in the conference title game, I think they're out. I think they probably need to go 11-2 to have a chance. But I think the other piece is when I look at the Big 12 and the ACC, this Utah team, assuming that Cam Rising is healthy, a lot depends on that when you're making this projection. I think that they have a chance to be the most complete team out of these two leagues. Defensively, this was a really, really good team last year, and they bring a whole lot of production back. Had to make some additions in the secondary, but I feel pretty good about what they have there. On offense, their offensive line, a little bit of an issue, but I think overall they're going to be okay at that position group. Wide receiver, they have a chance to be a lot better. Quarterback, of course, with Cameron Rising coming back, and also with the addition of Sam Hewitt as a transfer, I think they have a much higher floor than they did last season. And I think that you still have to like overall with players like Micah Bernard, what they have at running back to still be a really good team running the ball. So I think to me, the combination of path as well as margin of error overall means that Utah to me is my top overall team. And by the way, my only tier 2 team from either the Big 12 or the ACC.
That's an interesting one because I included Utah in my rankings or at least my initial list. I put them a little lower than I would have expected, only because I expect as I've said, the tradition of the conference of cannibals that the Pac-12 had to kind of continue into the Big 12. So I feel that they will emerge over Oklahoma State, K-State, Kansas, and perhaps Arizona or Iowa State. I mean, we've talked about this before, but I'm not sure. I'm wondering if they're going to come out not necessarily banged up, but certainly with potentially 2 losses and a lock though, because if they win that conference, they'll go through. I found myself hesitant. I found myself becoming more and more. I didn't want to be when I first heard this kind of tossed out months ago. I wasn't a fan of the idea that the Big 12 might not get 2 teams in, but now I'm actually having trouble fitting 2 teams, at least into my initial preseason playoff ranking, and therefore Utah is actually my only Big 12 team in my preseason ranking at this point, at least of teams that I think of the 11 P4s that will make it into the playoff at the end of the season. And it's interesting too, because I put them surprisingly low again because of that be up. The team that I actually wanted to include as a higher team, and I guess it's my it's my third SEC team, and this is a team where the schedule is so favorable. And the talent enough is there that there are strong reasons to think that they could really thrive as being that third team, because the as we've said before, when you made the 12-team playoff, Ole Miss is one of those teams that we thought was going to benefit from it. I agree, they might benefit from it, but to me, the team that's really going to take advantage this season is Mizzou. I am just convinced that Eli Drinkwitz is bringing back. Yes, they lost Blake Baker to LSU, great defensive coordinator, but they have so much talent there. They have Brady Cook, who's still there. They got Luther Burden III, who's one of the best receivers, period. They've got some good replacements for Cody Schrader with Marcus Carroll and Nate Knoll. And that schedule, again, I've joked before about their New England series that they've got there, but they go to A&M, they go to Alabama, and this is still going to be a strange Alabama year. I mean, again, a lot of good things going for Alabama. The talent that's left there, Kalen DeBoer's sheer talent as a coach goes without saying. But then it's like Oklahoma. So at that point, I'm kind of like, again, it's an SEC schedule. So again, that's going to be in their favor, but it's not the toughest SEC schedule. And with what they have going with momentum from last season, because again, what we saw, what they were able to do, they were able to go to Cotton Bowl and defeat Ohio State for that top 10 finish. I think Mizzou is going to surprise people and finish higher and end up as one of the playoff locks fairly early on this season.
So you mentioned it's not the toughest SEC schedule. I would actually make the case that it is the single easiest SEC schedule by a pretty good margin. Their non-conference slate, by the way, if you're curious, Murray State, Buffalo, Boston College, and UMass. I don't think that's going to win you a lot of fans. This is, I think, actually the interesting question, which is how many games can Missouri lose and make the playoff? Because I think so. I did not have them high on my. I had them in my tier 3, right? Very much under consideration, not in that top 2 tiers. The reason I think that I certainly think that their pathway to the playoff is very straightforward. There's no question about it. I think my question is, like, yes, they're an SEC team, but I don't think they're going to really be treated as one by the committee, because I think that if they go on the road and lose against Alabama, which is obviously like it's Alabama, obviously they have a chance to lose that game. I think that Alabama-Missouri game might decide a playoff spots, because I look at the rest of the schedule. We talked about Oklahoma. I'm not especially high on them. I think this could be a 6 or 7 win, like probably a 7-5 Oklahoma team. Not a bad team, but not one that I think is going to get you a whole lot of credit. Texas A&M is the only other ranked team on this schedule, and that's a road game as well. We'll kind of see what Texas A&M ends up being. But let's just say that Texas A&M ends up not being all that good. Let's say that they end up being a 7-5 team. I don't think it's going to happen. I think they're going to be more like a 9-win team. But let's say that they're bad. So you would have no ranked wins on the entire schedule, because nobody else. You look at the rest of the teams. You literally get every one of the worst teams in the SEC: Vanderbilt, Arkansas, Mississippi State, South Carolina. Like, that's crazy. I don't know. I mean, if they're 11-1 and their only loss is on the road at Alabama, I think that they get in. But like, at 10-2, I don't know if they do. I don't think they're going to be treated as another SEC 9-3 team.
Strictly speaking on schedule, they are absolutely the Iowa of the SEC right now, where we're like, this team certainly has a talent to finish a 1-loss, record in all of this. And I think it was funny too, because I actually decided not to put Iowa in my 11, but like they're right outside. But when I was looking at Mizzou, I said, I think they could pull it off. And by nature of, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because I do believe there is a little bit of inertia that always comes from the previous season. And I don't necessarily complain about it, only because, for example, Boise State had to do like 3 years in a row of just tremendous lift before they finally got that famous Fiesta Bowl opportunity, because they weren't getting the respect because they were in the Mountain West, all that stuff. So it's weird to use that for an SEC team. But let's say it was one of the name brands. Let's say Georgia somehow drew the weakest schedule in the SEC. I think no one would say anything about them rolling into, one loss, their one toughest game. People would still give them credit for being at Georgia. One of the teams on my list, I am giving credit because the name recognition is probably going to carry them in, even with a couple of losses. But I think I'm going to go with Mizzou only because that's why I think they will get enough. And I think last season built enough goodwill, enough of the talent is still there that I could see the people making the decision say, like, this is still the team. This is still most of the team we saw last year. But I'm curious to see where that goes. How about you? What's another team for you?
Well, just to close this out. So let's put them in our holding pattern right now. Okay, so let's put them right on the outside waiting for a second. Because here's what it comes down to. I think what will actually happen this season is that I think that 4 SEC teams are going to get in. I think that that Georgia and Texas are probably 2 of them. We're going to talk. I'll talk about Ole Miss next. I think that they're in a great position to make the college football playoff. I think it might be the winner of Missouri versus Alabama as the team that gets in. Like, because if Missouri goes on the road and loses to Alabama, and Alabama is a 2 or 3 loss team, but Missouri is a 10 or 11 win team, like, I don't know. I mean, if Alabama wins big, does Alabama get in as a loss down because they have a head-to-head? I think that's where the conversation becomes really interesting.
It's really interesting. Could we talk about Alabama then for a second? Because I think tying these two together, because for me, Alabama was my toughest in. It was the one where I finally said to myself, I could see them losing 2 games. I mean, one that I think would be Georgia. The other one could be just hey, we're still working out this system, kind of situation for Alabama where the fans would be upset, but I still think the committee would push them in because it's Alabama, and because the talent is certainly going to be there. We've talked about the cupboard is not bare by any stretch. It's interesting, though, that you phrase that Mizzou game being as one of them, because I could see Alabama going in if they lose to Georgia, lose to Mizzou, and manage to win those games. Because they are the other question games are, at Tennessee, at LSU, and at Oklahoma. Those are not, and at Wisconsin, to be fair. That one will very early on potentially decide whether or not Alabama is even going to be part of this conversation quite yet. But I put Alabama in as like one of my final teams, the one that bumped off the 11 spot for a couple of them, only because I do believe that the committee is going to be convinced about branding here as much as anything. But you think that Mizzou game could be the deciding factor. It's interesting there. I mean, because what if that is it? What if they lose to Georgia and Mizzou? Do you still think they're in?
I'd say that it'll be tough. So, again, I feel pretty confident that it's going to be 4 SEC teams. And right now we'll get to Ole Miss. We're kind of talking about 5 right now. And maybe preseason, it just has to be 5, right? Like maybe that's just where the conference is right now and how good it is at the top, especially. And look, we went through our list of contenders in the Big Ten. We only had 3 on our initial list. Maybe it's just going to be 8 combined from those 2 conferences. And instead it'll be 5 SEC, 3 Big Ten. Their schedule is interesting because it's good enough, right? Like they only have 1 top 10 game, which is Georgia, but then they have 4 games that are between 11 and 16, Tennessee, Missouri, LSU, Oklahoma. If they're able to go 3-1 in those games, I think that's probably enough to make it at 10-2. Like they're going to have a reasonably difficult schedule, I think, overall. They do play Vanderbilt and South Carolina, which I see as most likely being non-bowl teams. But at Wisconsin isn't nothing, right? Like I think that Wisconsin's a top 40 team. I think that'll be viewed pretty favorably by the committee. So I do think that if they're a 10-2 team, I think that Alabama probably finds their way in. Again, it's going to be interesting if it comes down to Alabama versus Missouri with the massive disparity between these 2 schedules. So I'm going to also put Alabama to the side for a second, and let's continue to go down this list. Ole Miss is an interesting one because they're putting a lot of pressure on this season when you look at what they've added via the transfer portal. And I think that overall, I mean, their schedule, similar sort of deal. They play number 13 LSU, number 16 Oklahoma, number 1 Georgia. The rest of the schedule is pretty manageable, though they have more of the like top 35 SEC teams with Kentucky, with Florida, I don't know if Arkansas is going to be one of those teams, but they do play at Arkansas, which can be a little bit of a tricky game. We'll kind of see if Wake Forest is able to get back to what they were when Sam Hartman was there. They're in a tough position. I would not want to be their collective manager right now for Wake Forest football. That can't be the most fun job in the world.
By the way, as an aside, did you see there was that site that picked them a newspaper that picked them to win their division of the Sun Belt? Because they totally misprinted. They not only misprinted, but they included the Razorbacks logo instead of Arkansas State.
My gosh,
that was my favorite.
My
favorite botch of the week. But.
Yikes! So I think Ole Miss is in a pretty good position. They've got a veteran quarterback in Jackson Dart entering his third season. I think that they've solidified that running back position to replace Quinshon Judkins. They've got one of the best receiving cores in the SEC, if not in the country. Defensively, I mean, we saw what they added with Walter Nolan coming on the defensive interior, Princely Umanmillion coming out on the edge. Like, I feel like this is the year, right? Like, they don't have to play Alabama. They get Georgia, but they get Georgia at home, and that's a loss I think that they can withstand. I think that they probably can beat LSU and Oklahoma. I think that this is a 10 or 11 win team. I have them ahead right now of Alabama, Missouri on my list, just because I think that their path is a little more straightforward. With Alabama, we didn't even really mention that they don't have Nick Saban anymore. They have a brand new coach. I think that throws just a level of chaos that you just don't know what it's going to be. It might be nothing, frankly, but I think that Ole Miss, with the consistency that they have, they didn't lose their offensive or defensive coordinator. I have them as a yes vote on my list. Did you?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I guiltily admit, or I don't know if I should say guiltily, but when I was putting together my list, I realized I had picked 5 SEC teams, and I tried to see could I move one of them off. And again, if I were, it's like, what do you wish for? But when it comes down to it, what would I actually bet on? And at this point, again, heading into the season, and it can shake up. That's what we do this. But I couldn't find a way not to include Ole Miss and Alabama. So that's why I ended up with 5 teams. They're spread apart from each other. Don't get me wrong. Alabama was my last team in because I felt weird. It wasn't like I felt weird not including them, but as I've said before, I mean, with Miami, right after, they've had their year at, so we've seen talented teams immediately the next year win with inferior coaches. Kalen DeBoer is not an inferior coach. So I could see them continuing on, even with a few hiccups, being the Alabama of not necessarily of old, but this transformation into the DeBoer Alabama era. So that's why, again, I included Ole Miss. I felt only because ease of schedule, and I agree, Ole Miss's schedule is not as tough as it's been in the past, but it's one that is achievable, especially with what Lane Kiffin has built there, the returning talent, the transfer talent. This should be their year to make it. More so, arguably, than their Big Ten equivalent. I think this is a year where Ole Miss really is likely to make the playoff, more so. So it was funny, too, because when I was kind of ranking them out, I had Mizzou. I decided to put them ahead of Ole Miss after I looked at the schedules. And I think, again, I just think they're going to get a little bit of a bump from last season, plus being SEC, even though it's not – it's a slightly off-brand version of the SEC that they're playing this season. And then my next team after them was Penn State, just because I don't know why. I don't know how to separate them. I just don't know.
They're the close of my tier 2. I had those 6 teams: Texas, Notre Dame, Utah, Penn State, Ole Miss, Alabama. That was my tier 2. And I think Penn State and Ole Miss, like you said, it's hard to unintertwine them. And let me tell you what, you want to talk some schedules right now. And if you're a Big Ten team, especially a top Big Ten team right now, you're about to feel how different the Power 2 leagues are, because the middle to bottom of the Big Ten is just not the same thing as the SEC, just frankly, not a shot, not just a statement. Penn State plays 2 ranked teams this year versus Ohio State. Okay, that's probably not going to go very well. At USC, it's probably going to go a whole lot better. And then, like, the rest of their schedule is, like, at West Virginia is kind of interesting, but I don't know that they can hang in the trenches with Penn State. Bowling Green, Kent State, Illinois, UCLA, Wisconsin is kind of interesting, but again, I don't know if they can hang. Washington, Purdue, Minnesota, Maryland. Like, I don't. Who even here should be able to conceivably compete, especially in the trenches with this Penn State team? To me, this is like they are not a tier 1 team because they're not a tier 1 team, obviously, but they're in a similar spot where I'm like, dude, if you don't make the playoff with this schedule and this year in this expanded field, I don't know what we're doing here.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of it is also, and we've talked about this, Andy Kotelnicki calling plays. How much room is he going to get to actually do his magic? The things he made work at Kansas, especially with hopefully unlocking Drew Aller for the potential that he's got there. Um, I'm curious to see where that one goes. I think, again, by all accounts, there has not been enough change in Penn State for me to decide that they're going to somehow do worse or not do what they always do. Michigan's obviously not. We're expecting Michigan to be a heavy reload project for a lot of reasons. So, but Oregon, unfortunately for Penn State, also joined the conference this year. So it's one of those circumstances where it feels like they're going to be that third team again. But the schedule, while difficult, seems to be one where I think they can make enough out of it to make this playoff. And that's exactly where I put them too. They were in my group. And I love this third tier position because I think I have a little, as I said, I have a little less confidence in Penn State than I do Ole Miss making it at this point. Even though they are typically bunched together, but this is interesting because it's funny too, because after them is when I had Utah for the record. Let's take a quick break. And when we come out back, we're going to round out who makes our initial list of teams to be in that final 12 here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
So, Shehan, let's get back to this. I just want to understand. So the tiers you have, obviously the locks. We got Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon. Then who are your – because I'm trying to remember because my second tier was a little different than yours. You went with Utah, Texas.
Yeah, Texas, Notre Dame, Utah, Penn State, Ole Miss, Alabama. And so we combined voted Texas, Notre Dame, Utah, Ole Miss onto the board so far. Missouri and Alabama, we're putting off to the side for a second. They're going to be definitely right in the middle of our conversation at the end as well. But I wanted to hold off a little bit because when I get to tier 3 and when I get to tier 4, I think is when things get really interesting, right? So tier 3, just to kind of describe for you what my tier 3 was. These are the teams that I view as the top contenders in the Big 12 and the ACC, the teams that have the most likely chance, let's say, to make it outside of Utah as the conference champions, and the teams that are right on the edge there for me as at-larges from the Big 10 and the SEC. Missouri was one of my tier 3 teams because I think that they're, again, with Alabama kind of right on that edge, but right in the middle of everything as well. And let me touch on my other SEC team from this list, and that's Tennessee. Tennessee is interesting. They come into the year ranked number 15, so in the AP poll, right on the outside looking in. Like I've said, I think that it's like they're not going to get 6 in, right? Realistically, they're not going to get 6 in, and so for that reason, I think that Tennessee probably does not make our initial field. But if you're looking for an upside play from the SEC, I think that Tennessee might be your team. Last year, they go 9-4, despite Joe Milton playing quarterback and being pretty inconsistent, being pretty injury prone. Brew McCoy missed a lot of the year at wide receiver. A lot of those aspects are just implicitly going to get better in 2024. They're going to be healthier. They bring in Nico at quarterback. I think that the fact that a down year or a rebuilding year or a reloading year, whatever you want to call it for Tennessee, is a 9-win team, that's huge for me, right? Like that's exactly what you want if you're a Tennessee fan, is to say, well, when we're trying to figure ourselves out, we're still winning 9 games. That's, I think, exactly how great programs act, especially on the way up the mountain. So now I will say too, right? They've got a first-year starting quarterback. They've got a system that I think offensively I still have some questions about as a long-term contender in the SEC, but they might have enough receiver talent to make it worth everyone's time. Defensively, this is a team that I don't think has gotten enough respect for what they've been able to do on that side of the ball over the last 2 years under Josh Heupel, because he is an offensive coach. So I think that, to me, they're on the outside, but they are sort of the team that I think is waiting there to crash the party. And I will say, or let me ask you, did you have in your other tiers any more SEC teams?
Tennessee was in my outside group, my outside
Yes.
looking in, because I think Tennessee needs one more year. I think Nico
Yes.
Iamaleava is a great quarterback. He's got a lot of promise. I mean, they have James Pierce. We've talked, talking about defense. Can't mention him. But I'm a little also worried about their schedule, only because they have so many other contenders. NC State was probably one of my third-tier teams into your category.
Great game.
So that's one that I'm concerned about. Oklahoma, they are the welcoming committee, as we've talked about. As soon as have a brutal schedule, welcome to the SEC. But that's still going to be an Oklahoma Sooners team at home. So who knows? That could be a tough one. And they get Alabama and Georgia. So again, it's Kalen DeBoer's Alabama. So we're assuming it's going to be an interesting. That's a tough rivalry game as it is, and it's going to be in Neyland. And at Georgia, I just think there's potential hiccups there for a team that I think is going to be good, but not quite. I think next year is going to be their year. And that's why I was able to just keep them outside of teams I think are going to make it, at least preseason.
Yeah, I sort of feel that way about Tennessee. I sort of feel that way about Oklahoma. I think that 2025 is more set up to be their year. I'm like obviously they're not in my field. I am so interested to watch Texas A&M play football this year because I don't think that they can get to playoff good. I don't think so. But I think they could get to top 15 good if some things break right for them. They open with Notre Dame. I'll tell you what, they can throw this whole thing out of whack if they go and beat Notre Dame handily in week 1. A tough schedule, but like they get Texas in a rivalry game, right? I think if I were to just pick that game right now, just because of all the dynamics around it and I think that Texas A&M understands they got to win this game, right? Like they got to win this game. They lost the last one in 2011. So let's just like say hypothetically that happens, that they beat Notre Dame and they beat Texas, both games of which are at home. I mean, like they're in really good position to make the college football playoff then.
Well, you extend Mike Elko for some ridiculous contract that will only curse them.
No. Ross Bjork is gone. Trev Alberts is not doing that. If Ross Bjork was there, he would do that, but he's gone. The rest of their tough schedule is Missouri and LSU, both of which are at home, by the way. That's crazy. To get all 4 of your ranked games at home, that's nuts. I'm not there with them, certainly, but they've got an experienced offensive line. They've got a great defensive line. They've got a pass rusher and Nick Scorington, who I think will be maybe the SEC's best. Just keep an eye on them. Keep an eye on them. Pay close attention to that game on August 31st.
So we have yet to discuss who we think from the ACC will make it. We should definitely touch on that team. Who do you have as the ACC I should say champ at this point?
Yeah, I have 2 teams in this group. One who I will say is my pick, and the other who I think is my sort of like safety valve, I guess you could say. I'm going to quickly say my safety valve is actually Florida State, which is the highest ranked team in the ACC in the preseason poll. But you know what? I don't know. I think that we're supposed to tomorrow release our official pick. And by the way, by the time this episode comes out, I think that this will be out over at cbssports.com. Make sure and check out our full ACC picks when this comes out. Or actually, I think, or maybe it's out now. I don't know. Anyway, point is, it'll be out by the time you're listening to this. My bold prediction from the ACC was that Florida State and Clemson are going to get locked out of the ACC title game. Because my champion, it's the U. It's the Miami Hurricanes. I'm doing it. This is a team on paper, and we don't play football games on paper, I get it, that really shouldn't have many issues. Offensively, they have a chance to be one of the best in the country. Cam Ward coming over at quarterback from Washington State. Damon Martinez from Oregon State at running back. They've taken full advantage of the Pac-2 falling apart. Also, you add a transfer in Sam Brown at wide receiver from Houston, who teams up with Xavier Restrepo, who might be one of the most underrated receivers in the country. Their offensive line has a chance to be really good. They've got a defensive line led by Ruben Bain that has a chance to be really good. I think that there are 4 or 5 teams that are going to be right there at the end of the year from the ACC. I think Miami is my team.
Yeah, I love that we're on the same boat here. I was debating about I was debating about Clemson. I looked really hard at Clemson, even though I know a lot of complaints about Dabo and the way he's running his program and sticking to his guns on player development. That opener at Georgia, maybe I think I decided, they play at Georgia. They've got some other tough games in that schedule for them. Whereas Miami, maybe I'm being fooled. Maybe it is all the glitz and glamour. Maybe it's the spending all this time in Latin America. I just feel like I have to root for Miami and kind of go for all of that. But I have to say, Louisville, I thought the schedule was a little tough especially when I broke it down. NC State is the one I also was really there. They are actually the more I actually reviewed it, I actually pushed Clemson and North Carolina State as my two ACC teams that if we were looking for an at-large from that conference, it could be one of those two. When I picked a fifth SEC team, I realized it probably wasn't going to be either of them. But if one of them makes it in, I could see one of those two teams making it. If there is a second that's going to come out of it, especially, for example, with NC State, if they beat Tennessee, if they just don't quite make it all the way through the ACC unscathed, I could see them sneaking in by the strength of their schedule, but or at least with the teams that they have played and the teams that they've beaten. But I think when it comes down to it, Miami is just kind of the fashionable choice. I'll fully admit this. It is the glitz, it is the glamour, it is the U. I'm going with them. I can't pick USC. My alma mater, no way they're going to make it. So I'm going to pick the East Coast equivalent, which is those folks in South Florida, my friend. Coral Gables, baby. That's all what it's all about.
Well, you don't want the Middle America version of your alma mater, which is SMU, right in my backyard.
I was about to say it's SMU.
I don't, for the record, have SMU on my list, though they are on my short list of teams that I think can contend from the ACC as well. I actually have Miami again. So I did check. Our CBS Sports predictions are up. Make sure and keep an eye on those all week long over at cbssports.com to get all of my picks for every single one of the conferences, top to bottom. But my top two were Miami and my tier 4 team, by the way, NC State. The issue with Miami and NC State being the top two teams for me from this conference is that I don't think that they get the implicit credibility of losing the title game and getting in. I think that if everything was the same for NC State, but they had a Clemson logo, that might be enough, right? Like, I think that credibility might be enough. I don't think that this team is going to have it, though. And so I ultimately did decide that over Florida State, over NC State, over Louisville, by the way, NC State and Louisville, both tier 4 teams for me, I just have Miami in from the ACC. I don't have any other teams. And there are going to be a number of teams, I think, that are right on that line. And again, if Florida State manages to have an 11-1 type year, even if they lose to Miami in the ACC title game, I think that they still have a decent chance of getting in. But Miami's my team.
How about the Big 12? Do you have any other teams that you think will be in, or just teams that you think could play their way in, depending on how the conference crumbles?
I don't think that there are any other locks, certainly. And, we had this conversation, 5 months ago or whatever, when we made our way too early college football playoff picks. And I think that some of the same dynamics that I think are still true, which is that the Big 12 will have 6 teams that are in like the top 22, and 5 of them are going to be ranked something like 18th through 22nd. Like, it's just going to be that kind of year, I think, for the conference. I think the ACC, actually, what's funny is you look at their schedules. I look at a schedule like Louisville. I look at a schedule like SMU. There are going to be a lot of teams that win like 10 games, but aren't in the top 12 just because of the way that the schedules work out. And so for me, the only other team that I had in tier 3 was Kansas State. And I can't quite get there on Kansas State. I think this is going to be a little bit of a transition year, like what we're talking about with Tennessee. They've got a first-year starting quarterback in Avery Johnson. They've got 2 young running backs who I am incredibly excited about in DJ Giddens and Dylan Edwards. Like, this is a team that in 2025 might just light college football on fire. I'm just a little worried going into a transition year where they replace a lot of key guys on the offensive line, where they lost some production in the secondary, where I don't know that they have a great pass rush. I don't necessarily know that this is going to be a peak Kansas State type team. And when I look at the Big 12 especially, and everybody knows I'm kind of the Big 12 guy here, I just think that college football is about development cycles. It's about who is hitting the top of their development in a given year, and that team is going to be the one that has the best chance to make the playoff. I don't think Kansas State is that team. I will mention one other team that I had in tier 4 that I think might be more at the top of their development cycle, and that's Kansas. Kansas, if Jalen Daniels is healthy, could be a complete football team. Like, I think they could. I think that at quarterback, they have one who might be a top 5 to 10 player in the league when he's healthy, or in college football when he's healthy, and Jalen Daniels. They've got a stacked senior heavy receiving core. They've got a running back in Devin Neal who's awesome. Their offensive line is old. Their defense has 2 preseason all Big 12 players in the secondary, so this is not an old Kansas defense as we kind of think of them. So I think that Kansas is a team that can get in the conversation. And actually, the team that I think is most poised, and I've talked about this team repeatedly all offseason, to get into that conversation as well, is Iowa State. The issue with Iowa State is that, just frankly, I don't say this as a value judgment, they're going to lose to Iowa, right? Like, they're going to lose to Iowa in week 2 because they always lose to Iowa. They do this every single year, and then they might come back and win 9 or 10 games. But I don't know if they can overcome losing in week 2 to an Iowa team that probably won't be in the playoff conversation. So I think that Iowa State has to win the Big 12 to make the playoff. And that's why, for me, I can't have them, and why I currently don't have them in one of my top 4 tiers.
I think that's fair. At this point, I think we've named all of my teams as well, in terms of teams I think are going to be just inside or outside. Because, again, my outside teams were North Carolina State, Iowa, which, again, only because I think if they somehow win out or just lose to Ohio State, there's a puncher's chance. Although I think they're in that same boat that you viewed Mizzou in. Although I think Mizzou will get that SEC bump that I'm not sure Iowa will get. Clemson, Louisville, the potential of an Oklahoma State, Kansas State, Iowa State to maybe win out in the or Kansas to win out in that Big 12.
Well, real quick. So if we put Missouri and Alabama in, I believe we're only at 10 teams. We're at Georgia, Oregon, Ohio State, Texas.
Well, mine was Ohio State, Georgia, Oregon, Notre Dame, Texas, Mizzou, Ole Miss, Penn State, Utah, Miami, and Alabama.
I forgot to write down Penn State. There we go. That's the discrepancy. So yes, we're at 11. 5 of them are from the SEC. 3 of them are from the Big 10. There's the sort of neutral Notre Dame that you could throw into there, which, by the way, they easily could fall out and create another spot. But only one from the ACC. Only one from the Big 12.
And maybe that's because of Notre Dame. It really is because of Notre Dame. That's what I also realized. Notre Dame kind of ate the other ACC spot because they're going to have to play through so many of those other contenders.
I really feel like we're only going to end up with 4 SEC. I really do. I feel like we're going to end up with 4. Whether it's, Ole Miss struggling or whether it's one of Missouri or Alabama playing their way out, I think we're going to probably create another spot for the Big 12 and or ACC. Like I talked about, there are multiple teams from each of these leagues that I think will be in the 10-win conversation.
Got to make room for Rutgers, baby. You got to make room for Rutgers somehow.
Yeah, we got to get our 4. Well, and I did assume heading in that the Big 10 was also going to get 4. Like, that was my assumption when I started putting this together. But we didn't talk about Michigan, and that is obviously a team that ended up on our list of big picture contenders. I had them right on the tier 3, tier 4 line. I ultimately put them in tier 3. But I just don't know, man. Like, I just don't know. There are just too many games on the schedule that are losable. And I don't think that there are enough good wins to offset it unless they beat Ohio State, right? And so to me, they're on the outside as well. I also just don't think this is going to be an especially notable team. It is a transition year with how much they lost. But I do think that we do at least need to mention them.
Yeah, no, we should mention them, although I admit I couldn't figure out how they would fit into this just with all the transition. And
they played 3 of the top 4 preseason teams, by the way. Number 2, Ohio State. Number 3, Oregon. Number 4, Texas. That's insane.
And right on schedule, they're firing up the offseason drama cycle that we're gonna be dealing with. Then can't wait. So, but now we should take a second to talk about the G5 because one of them is going to make it in. what were three of the teams that you put out there as your contenders? I assume Memphis is one of them.
Memphis is one of them. Boise State is another. And I think you have to include Liberty.
Oh
at
my
this point.
gosh. Liberty's, those are my three, but I had to include Liberty, and this is the way I thought about it. I used to love watching The Price is Right as a kid. There'd always be whenever the contestants would be there to get them onto the show, they'd call those contestants and they'd have to guess the price of something. Liberty is the guy at the end picking $1 just to catch all the possible prices underneath the actual retail price if everyone else went high. Liberty is my $1. If for some reason the G5 implodes again, the AC, the American and the Mountain West and the Sun Belt, and I should include the MAC, just tear each other apart, Liberty is going to come and take the lowest common spot, because their schedule is somehow weaker than last season, and they're going to make it. They're probably going to be undefeated or close to it, and they're going to make it in. I'd probably have to go undefeated, but I do believe this is yet another schedule that Liberty is going to run the table, and whether they make it or not is completely dependent on whether Boise State or Memphis can, again, the other teams in those conferences can maybe. There are other teams. There are other teams. I mean, obviously, we've talked about it. UNLV could. Air Force could somehow bring it together, which is a little less likely because of all the changeover. You've got, some excellent contenders in the American with UTSA or even South Florida. But at the same time, or Tulane, but at the same time, I agree with you. I think it's going to be Boise State or Memphis, but if those conferences go kaput, it is quite likely going to be the Liberty Flames back again. And with the way we rank this, quite possibly playing Oregon again. Don't worry, this time it'll be in Autzen. It'll be so much better than a half-empty stadium in Phoenix.
Well, the funny thing is, I think that Boise State and Liberty are probably the two most likely to me. Now, maybe Memphis manages to get in. Both of those games would be rematches because Boise State plays Oregon this year. So, it's going to be a little bit of a weird deal. I'm curious if the committee, here's the thing is that if Oregon is as good as we think that they are and just lose in the Big Ten title game, it's going to be really hard not to put them at number 5, right? It's going to be really hard. There might be a legitimate gap between them and, I don't know, who would be number 6. Texas right now would probably number 6. Notre Dame could get into that group. It's going to be something, man. It's going to be something. I hope for everyone's sake, also because, I'm trying to plan some stuff. I'm hoping that Boise State at least has a good game against Oregon and doesn't get libertied. But nothing would be a bigger damper for the expanded college football playoff than getting an Oregon Liberty rematch, especially if it were to go similarly.
Oh, it would be such a moment for the G5 that they would all be frustrated. Because it's been discussed, the G5 really should perform. We hope they perform well in these, especially these first two 12-team playoff series, just to show that there should remain a spot. I think there should always remain a spot for the G5, especially in any expanded playoff. But to have a blowout of the nature that we had last season would be awful, because for some reason it erases everybody's memories of all the teams that managed to win their New Year's Six spot. And that is an ultimate shame. That is absolutely the worst, including Boise State a couple of times. That's the worst part about it. So, my goodness. Well, we've been going on for quite a bit. I think this is a good spot to wrap this one up. We're going to come back with some more conversation, and maybe even some of our conference picks next episode. But I wanted to thank all of you who listen to us. I wanted to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show. He's Shehan Raja. You can find his work at CBSSports.com and at Shehan Raja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Kairi, part of the group that runs CFP on Reddit. Thanks for listening, everyone. Adios, amigos.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.